Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
The Tale of Mr. Todd by Beatrix Potter, 1866 to 1943. I've written many books about well-behaved people, but now, for a change, I'm going to tell a story about two disagreeable characters named Tommy Brock and Mr. Todd. No one could ever call Mr. Todd nice. The rabbits couldn't stand him. They could smell him from half a mile away. He was a wandering sort with fox-like whiskers, and they never knew where he would turn up next. One day he was living in a stick house in the thicket, causing terror for the family of old Mr. Benjamin Bouncer. The next day he moved into a pollard willow by the lake, frightening the wild ducks and the water rats. In winter and early spring he could usually be found in a burrow among the rocks at the top of Bull Banks under Oatmeal Crag. He had half a dozen houses, but he was rarely at home. The houses weren't always empty when Mr. Todd moved out, because sometimes Tommy Brock moved in without asking for permission. Tommy Brock was a short, bristly, fat waddler with a grin that covered his whole face. He wasn't nice in his habits. He ate wasp nests, frogs, and worms, and he wandered about by moonlight digging things up. His clothes were very dirty, and since he slept during the day, he never bothered to take off his boots before going to bed. The bed he used was usually Mr. Todd's. Tommy Brock occasionally ate rabbit pie, but only very young rabbits when other food was really scarce. He got along well with old Mr. Bouncer. They both disliked the wicked otters and Mr. Todd, and they often discussed that difficult topic. Old Mr. Bouncer was getting on in years. He sat in the spring sunshine outside the burrow, wrapped in a muffler, smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco. He lived with his son, Benjamin Buddy, and his daughter-in-law, Flopsy, who had a young family. That afternoon, old Mr. Bouncer was in charge of the family because Benjamin and Flopsy had gone out. The little baby rabbits were just old enough to open their blue eyes and start kicking. They lay in a soft bed of rabbit fur and hay, in a small burrow separate from the main rabbit hole. Honestly, old Mr. Bouncer had completely forgotten about them. He sat in the sun chatting cheerfully with Tommy Brock, who was walking through the woods carrying a sack, a small spade for digging, and some mole traps. He grumbled about the shortage of pheasant eggs and accused Mr. Todd of stealing them. And the otters had eaten all the frogs while he was hibernating during the winter. I haven't had a proper meal in 2 weeks. I'm surviving on pig nuts. I might even have to turn vegetarian and eat my own tail, said Tommy Brock. It wasn't much of a joke, but it amused old Mr. Bouncer because Tommy Brock was so fat, stubby, and always grinning. So old Mr. Bouncer laughed and invited Tommy Brock inside to try a slice of seed cake and a glass of my daughter Flopsy's cowslip wine. Tommy Brock eagerly squeezed himself into the rabbit hole. Then old Mr. Bouncer lit another pipe and gave Tommy Brock a cabbage leaf cigar, which was so strong that it made Tommy Brock grin even wider as the smoke filled the burrow. Old Mr. Bouncer coughed and laughed, while Tommy Brock puffed away with a big grin. Mr. Bouncer kept laughing and coughing, shutting his eyes against the cabbage smoke. When Flopsy and Benjamin returned, old Mr. Bouncer woke up. Tommy Brock and all the baby rabbits were gone. Mr. Bouncer refused to admit that he had let anyone into the burrow, but the smell of badger was unmistakable, and there were large round footprints in the sand. Benjamin Buddy immediately set off after Tommy Brock. It wasn't hard to track him. He had left footprints and moved slowly up the winding path through the woods. In some spots he had torn up the moss and wood sorrel. At one point he had dug a deep hole for darnel and set a mole trap. A small stream crossed the path. Benjamin hopped over it easily, while the badger's heavy steps were clearly visible in the mud. The path led to a clearing in the thicket where the trees had been cut down. There were leafy oak stumps and a sea of blue hyacinths, but the scent that made Benjamin stop wasn't from the flowers. Mr. Todd's stick house stood before him, and for once Mr. Todd was home. Not only could Benjamin smell the telltale fox scent, there was smoke coming from the broken pail that served as a chimney. Benjamin Bunny sat up, staring, his whiskers twitching. From inside the house, someone dropped a plate and said something. Benjamin stamped his foot and bolted. He didn't stop until he reached the other side of the woods. It seemed Tommy Brock had gone the same way. On top of the wall were more badger tracks along with bits of a sack caught on a briar. Benjamin climbed over the wall into a meadow. He found another freshly set mole trap. He was still following Tommy Brock. It was late afternoon, and other rabbits were coming out to enjoy the cool evening air. One wearing a blue coat was hunting for dandelions by himself. "Cousin Peter, Peter Rabbit, Benjamin Bunny shouted. The blue-coated rabbit sat up, his ears alert. "What's the matter, Cousin Benjamin? Is it a cat or John Stout Ferret?" No, Tommy Brock. He's caught my family in a sack. Have you seen him?" "Tommy Brock, how many, Cousin Benjamin?" "7, Cousin Peter, and they're all twins. Did he come this way? Please tell me quickly." Yes, just 10 minutes ago." "Which way? Where did he go, Cousin Peter?" "He had a sack with something alive in it. I saw him set a mole trap." "Let me think for a moment. Cousin Benjamin, can you start from the beginning?" Benjamin explained everything. "My Uncle Bouncer has shown a disappointing lack of judgment for his age," Peter said thoughtfully. "But there are 2 good things. Your family is alive and well, and Tommy Brock has had something to eat. He'll probably fall asleep and save them for breakfast." "Which way?" "Cousin Benjamin, calm down. I know exactly where he went. Since Mr. Todd was home in the stick house, Tommy must have gone to Mr. Todd's other house at the top of Bull Banks." Peter hid his dandelions and followed the worried parrot, who was all flustered. They crossed several fields and started climbing the hill, where Tommy Brock's tracks were easy to spot. It looked like he'd put down the sack every few yards to rest. "He must be exhausted. We're right behind him by the smell." "What a terrible creature," said Peter. The sunshine was still warm, shining down on the hill pastures. Halfway up, Cottontail sat in her doorway, watching 4 or 5 half-grown rabbits playing nearby. One was black and the others were brown. Cottontail had seen Tommy Brock passing in the distance. When asked, she replied that Tommy had rested twice while she watched him. "Come on, Peter, he's going to cook them. Hurry up," said Benjamin Bunny. They kept climbing higher. He was home. I saw his black ears peeking out of the hole. "Let's go, Cousin Benjamin." As they approached the woods at the top of Bull Banks, they moved cautiously. The trees grew among heaped-up rocks, and there, beneath a crag, Mr. Todd had made one of his homes. It was at the top of a steep bank with rocks and bushes hanging over it. The rabbits crept up carefully, listening and peeking. This house was a mix between a cave, a prison, and a run-down pigsty. There was a strong door that was shut and locked. The setting sun made the window panes glow like red flames, but the kitchen fire wasn't lit. The dry sticks were neatly arranged, as the rabbits could see when they peeked through the window. Benjamin sighed with relief. However, there were things on the kitchen table that made him shudder. There was a large empty pie dish with a blue willow pattern, a big carving knife and fork, and a chopper. At the other end of the table was a partly unfolded tablecloth, a plate, a tumbler, a knife and fork, a salt cellar, mustard, and a chair. In short, everything prepared for one person's supper. No one could be seen, and there were no young rabbits. The kitchen was empty and silent. The clock had stopped. Peter and Benjamin pressed their noses against the window, staring into the dusk. Then they scrambled around the rocks to the other side of the house. It was damp and smelled bad, overgrown with thorns and briars. The rabbits shivered in their shoes. "Oh, my poor baby rabbits! What a terrible place! I'll never see them again," sighed Benjamin. They crept up to the bedroom window. It was closed and bolted like the kitchen, but there were signs that this window had been recently opened. The cobwebs were disturbed and fresh, dirty footprints marked the windowsill. Inside the room was so dark that at first they couldn't see anything, but they could hear a noise, a slow, deep, regular snoring grunt. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized someone was asleep on Mr. Todd's bed, curled up under the blanket. "He went to bed still wearing his boots," whispered Peter. Benjamin, feeling anxious, pulled Peter away from the windowsill. Tommy Brock's snores came from Mr. Todd's bed, deep and grunty. They couldn't see anything of the rabid children. The sun had set, and an owl began to hoot in the woods. There were many unpleasant things scattered around that really should have been buried. Rabbit bones, skulls, chicken legs, and other horrors. It was a shocking place and very dark. They returned to the front of the house and tried every way they could to move the bolt on the kitchen window. They even attempted to push a rusty nail between the window sashes, but it was no use, especially without a light. They sat side by side outside the window, whispering and listening. Half an hour later, the moon rose over the woods. It shone bright, clear, and cold on the house among the rocks, and through the kitchen window. But alas, there were no little rabbit babies to be seen. The moonbeams sparkled on the carving knife and the pie dish, creating a path of brightness across the dirty floor. The light revealed a small door in the wall next to the kitchen fireplace, a little iron door that belonged to a brick oven, the kind that used to be heated with bundles of wood. Then, at the same moment, Peter and Benjamin noticed that whenever they shook the window, the little door across from them shook in response. The little ones were alive, shut up in the oven. They dug and dug for hours. They couldn't tunnel straight because of the stones, but by the end of the night, they were underneath the kitchen floor. Benjamin lay on his back, scratching upward, while Peter, his claws worn down, was outside the tunnel, shuffling sand away. He called out that it was morning, sunrise, and that the jays were making noise down in the woods. Benjamin Bunny emerged from the dark tunnel, shaking sand from his ears and cleaning his face with his paws. With each passing minute, the sun grew warmer at the top of the hill. In the valley, a sea of white mist lay spread out, with golden treetops peeking through. In a panic, the two rabbits completely lost their heads. They made the most foolish decision possible. They rushed back into their short new tunnel and hid themselves at the far end under Mr. Todd's kitchen floor. Mr. Todd was coming up Bull Banks, and he was in particularly foul mood. First, he had been upset by breaking a plate. It was his own fault, but it was a china plate, the last of the dinner service that had belonged to his grandmother, old Vixen Todd. Then the midges had been terrible. To top it off, he had failed to catch a hen pheasant on her nest, which had only 5 eggs, 2 of them spoiled. Mr. Todd had endured a thoroughly unsatisfactory night. As usual, when he was in a bad mood, he decided to move house. He first approached a pollard willow, but it was damp and the otters had left a dead fish nearby. Mr. Todd didn't like anyone's leftovers but his own. He continued up the hill, his temper worsening as he noticed unmistakable signs of badger activity. No one else digs up the moss as carelessly as Tommy Brock. Mr. Todd angrily smacked his stick against the ground, fuming as he figured out where Tommy Brock had gone. He was even more irritated by the persistent jaybird that followed him. The bird flitted from tree to tree, squawking warnings to every rabbit within earshot that either a cat or a fox was coming through the woods. Once, when the bird flew right over his head, Mr. Todd tried to snap at it and let out a bark. He approached his house carefully, holding a large rusty key. He sniffed the air and his whiskers twitched. The house was locked. but Mr. Todd wasn't sure if it was really empty. He turned the rusty key in the lock, and the rabbits below could hear it. Mr. Todd slowly opened the door and stepped inside. What Mr. Todd saw in his kitchen made him furious. There was his chair, his pie dish, his knife and fork, mustard, salt, shaker, and the tablecloth he had neatly folded on the dresser, all set out for a meal, clearly for that awful Tommy Brock. The air smelled of fresh dirt and filthy badger, which luckily covered up any rabbit scent. What really caught Mr. Todd's attention was the sound, a deep, slow, snoring grunt coming from his own bed. He peeked through the crack in the half-open bedroom door. Then he quickly left the house, his whiskers twitching and his coat collar standing up in pure rage. For the next 20 minutes, Mr. Todd kept sneaking cautiously into the house, only to hurry back out again. Little by little, he went further inside, eventually making it to the bedroom. Outside, he scratched the ground in frustration, but inside, he didn't like the sight of Tommy Brock's sharp teeth. Tommy Brock was lying on his back, grinning with his mouth wide open, snoring peacefully, but one of his eyes was completely closed. Mr. Todd kept going in and out of the bedroom. Twice he brought in his walking stick, and once he carried in the coal scuttle, but each time he changed his mind and took them back out. When he returned after taking the coal scuttle away, Tommy Brock was lying a bit more on his side, but he seemed to be in an even deeper sleep. He was hopelessly lazy and wasn't the least bit worried about Mr. Todd. He was just too relaxed to bother moving. Mr. Todd came back into the bedroom with a clothesline. He stood for a moment watching Tommy Brock and listening closely to his snores. They were very loud but sounded completely normal. Mr. Todd turned his back to the bed and started opening the window. It creaked and he quickly spun around. Tommy Brock, who had opened one eye, quickly shut it again. The snores continued. Mr. Todd's actions were strange and made him feel uneasy, especially since the bed was positioned between the window and the bedroom door. He opened the window slightly and pushed most of the clothesline out onto the windowsill, keeping the rest in his hand with a hook at the end. Tommy Brock snored loudly. Mr. Todd watched him for a moment before leaving the room. Tommy Brock opened both eyes, noticed the rope, and smiled. He heard a noise outside the window and quickly shut his eyes again. Mr. Todd exited through the front door and walked around to the back of the house. On his way, he tripped over a rabbit burrow. If he had known who was inside, he would have yanked them out immediately. His foot almost stepped on Peter Rabbit and Benjamin in the tunnel, but luckily he assumed it was just more of Tommy Brock's doing. He picked up the coil of rope from the windowsill, paused to listen, then secured it to a tree. Tommy Brock watched through the window with one eye, feeling puzzled. Mr. Todd fetched a large, heavy bucket of water from the spring and staggered with it through the kitchen and into his bedroom. Tommy Brock snored loudly with a bit of a snort. Mr. Todd set the bucket down beside the bed, picked up the end of the rope with the hook, hesitated, and glanced at Tommy Brock. The snoring was nearly choking, but the grin on his face wasn't quite as big. Carefully, Mr. Todd climbed onto a chair at the head of the bed. His legs were uncomfortably close to Tommy Brock's teeth. He reached up and looped the rope with the hook over the top of the bed frame, where the curtains should have been. Mr. Todd's curtains were folded up and stored away since the house had been unoccupied, along with the counterpane. Tommy Brock was only covered with a blanket. Standing on the shaky chair, Mr. Todd looked down at him closely. He was definitely a champion sleeper. It seemed like nothing could wake him, not even the rope flapping across the bed. Mr. Todd climbed down from the chair safely and tried to get back up again, this time with a bucket of water. His plan was to hang it from the hook, dangling over Tommy Brock's head, and rig it up as a sort of shower that could be triggered with a string from the window. Naturally, being a thin-legged person, though vindictive and with sandy whiskers, he couldn't lift the heavy weight to the level of the hook and rope. He almost lost his balance. The snores grew louder and more dramatic. One of Tommy Brock's hind legs twitched under the blanket, but he continued to sleep peacefully. Mr. Todd and the pail safely descended from the chair. After thinking for a while, he poured the water into a wash basin and a jug. The empty pail wasn't too heavy for him. He swung it up over Tommy Brock's head, wobbling as he did so. Surely there has never been a sleeper like this. Mr. Todd kept getting up and down on the chair. Since he couldn't lift the whole pail of water at once, he grabbed a milk jug and gradually ladled quarts of water into the pail. The pail filled up more and more, swinging like a pendulum. Occasionally, a drop splashed over, but Tommy Brock continued to snore steadily, hardly moving except for one eye. At last, Mr. Todd's preparations were complete. The pail was full of water, and the rope was tightly secured over the bed and across the windowsill to the tree outside. It's going to make a huge mess in my bedroom, but I could never sleep in that bed again without giving it a thorough cleaning, Mr. Todd said. He took one last look at the badger and quietly left the room. He stepped outside and closed the front door. The rabbits heard his footsteps echoing through the tunnel. He ran around to the back of the house, planning to untie the rope and let the pail of water fall on Tommy Brock. "I'll wake him up with an unpleasant surprise," Mr. Todd said. As soon as he left, Tommy Brock jumped up in a hurry. He rolled up Mr. Todd's dressing gown into a bundle, placed it in the bed under the pail of water instead of himself, and left the room grinning widely. He went into the kitchen, lit the fire, and boiled the kettle. For the moment, he wasn't concerned about cooking the baby rabbits. When Mr. Todd reached the tree, he discovered that the weight and tension had tightened the knot so much that it was impossible to untie. He had no choice but to gnaw at it with his teeth. He bit and chewed for over 20 minutes. Finally, the rope snapped with such a sudden jolt that it almost yanked his teeth out and sent him tumbling backward. Inside the house, there was a loud crash and a splash, followed by the sound of the pail rolling across the floor. But there were no screams. Mr. Todd was puzzled. He stayed completely still, listening carefully. Then he peeked in through the window. Water was dripping from the bed, and the pail had rolled into a corner. In the middle of the bed, under the blanket, was a wet, flattened lump, dented in the middle where the pail had landed, right across the stomach. Its head was covered by the soaked blanket, and the snoring had stopped. Nothing was moving, and the only sound was the steady drip, drop, drip of water trickling from the mattress. Mr. Todd watched for half an hour, his eyes gleaming. Then, feeling confident, he even danced a little jig and grew so bold that he tapped on the window. But the bundle didn't move. Yes, there was no doubt about it. It had turned out even better than he had imagined. The pail had hit poor old Tommy Brock and killed him on the spot. "I'll bury that awful badger in the hole he dug himself. Then I'll bring my bedding outside to dry in the sun," Mr. Todd said. "I'll wash the tablecloth and lay it out on the grass to bleach in the sun. The blanket needs to be hung up in the wind, and the bed must be disinfected, aired out properly, and kept warm with a hot water bottle. I'll get soft soap, monkey soap, all kinds of soap, along with soda and scrubbing brushes. I'll use Persian powder and carbolic to get rid of the smell. I might even have to burn sulfur to disinfect the whole place." He rushed around the house to fetch a shovel from the kitchen. "First I'll prepare the hole, then I'll drag that badger out of the bedroll." He opened the door, and there was Tommy Brock sitting at Mr. Todd's kitchen table, pouring himself tea from Mr. Todd's teapot into Mr. Todd's teacup. He was completely dry and grinning widely. Without warning, he flung the cup of scalding tea all over Mr. Todd. Then Mr. Todd rushed at Tommy Brock, and the two wrestled fiercely amid the broken crockery, turning the kitchen into a battleground. From underneath, the rabbits could hear the crashes and bangs, fearing the floor might give way at any moment. They cautiously crept out of their tunnel and hid among the rocks and bushes, listening anxiously. Inside the house, the noise was terrifying. The baby rabbits, still locked in the oven, woke up trembling. Perhaps it was a stroke of luck they were shut inside. Everything in the kitchen was overturned except for the sturdy table. Everything else was shattered except the mantelpiece and the kitchen fender. The crockery lay smashed to bits. The chairs were in pieces, the window broken, and the clock crashed to the floor. Clumps of Mr. Todd's sandy whiskers littered the room. Vases toppled off the mantelpiece, canisters tumbled off the shelf, and the kettle fell off the hob. Tommy Brock even stepped into a jar of raspberry jam, and boiling water from the kettle spilled onto Mr. Todd's tail. When the kettle fell, Tommy Brock, still grinning, ended up on top. He rolled Mr. Todd over and over like a log, pushing him right out the door. The snarling and scuffling continued outside as they tumbled down the bank, bumping over rocks as they rolled downhill. It's safe to say that Tommy Brock and Mr. Todd will never be friends. Once the way was clear, Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny slipped out from behind the bushes. "All right, go on, Cousin Benjamin. Get inside and grab them while I keep watch at the door." But Benjamin was nervous. "Oh no, they're coming back." "No, they're not." "Yes, they are. I think they've fallen into the stone quarry." Still Benjamin hesitated, and Peter kept urging him. "Hurry, it's fine. Close the oven door, Cousin Benjamin, so he won't notice they're gone." Things hadn't been very comfortable at home in the rabbit hole. After arguing over supper, Flopsy and old Mr. Bouncer spent a sleepless night and quarreled again at breakfast. Old Mr. Bouncer could no longer deny that he invited guests into the rabbit hole, but he refused to answer Flopsy's questions and complaints. The day dragged on. Old Mr. Bouncer, sulking, huddled in a corner behind a chair. Flopsy had taken away his pipe and hidden the tobacco. To relieve her frustration, she'd started a full-blown spring cleaning and had just finished. Behind the chair, Mr. Bouncer anxiously wondered what she would do next. Meanwhile, in Mr. Todd's kitchen, amidst the chaos, Benjamin Bunny nervously made his way to the oven through a cloud of dust. He opened the oven door, reached in, and felt something warm and wriggling. He carefully lifted it out and rejoined Peter Rabbit. "I've got them. Can we leave? Should we hide, Cousin Peter?" Peter's ears twitched. The distant sounds of fighting still echoed through the woods. 5 minutes later, 2 breathless rabbits came scurrying down Bull Banks, half carrying, half dragging a sack between them, bouncing over the grass. They made it home safely and burst into the rabbit hole. Old Mr. Bouncer was greatly relieved, and Flopsy was overjoyed when Peter and Benjamin triumphantly returned with the young ones. The rabbit babies were a bit ruffled and very hungry, but they were quickly fed and put to bed. They soon bounced back. A brand new pipe and a fresh supply of rabbit tobacco were presented to Mr. Bouncer. He tried to keep his dignity, but he accepted them anyway. All was forgiven, and they sat down to dinner. Peter and Benjamin shared their tale, but they hadn't stayed long enough to know how the fight between Tommy Brock and Mr. Todd ended.